Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to an FS Club webinar. This is part of our CommunityZ Chest series, and this is where we have a conversation with somebody whom we think is very, very interesting in our group, but who is really not necessarily trying to preach at us. And so today we're going to feature Edmund Fitton-Brown. Now, Edmund, as you'll have gathered when you registered, has got a very distinguished diplomatic career. Many of you will also know that I'm hardly considered to be a diplomat, so I'll try and be quiet during most of this and let Edmund do the talking. But he's done an amazing amount of service around the world, both for the British Foreign Office, but now doing a tremendous amount with the UN. And I think there's some interesting angles for us, particularly as people in technology, finance, and economics, of Edmund's experiences looking at terrorism around the world, looking at the groups like Al-Qaida and Daesh, and saying to us, where do we fit in and what should we expect? So I'm looking forward to a fun chat. I would point out it is meant to be a discussion with the community, so please do use the GoToWebinar facility for asking questions, which I will feed in to a conversation with Edmund later on. Edmund does have a few prepared remarks at the beginning. I'm going to open, though, if I could, with thanks. Thanks to our sponsors. It is an amazingly tolerant group of people who let us range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance, and really follow our intellectual hearts, if you can do such a thing. I guess our hearts follow our heads. And we get to explore all sorts of areas. And today I'm looking forward to, because I do think we have a lot to learn. Many of the people you can see on this chart are very involved in financing, and certainly not financing terrorism, and also providing the technology that helps us with things like anti-money laundering and prevention of financing funds. So enough of that. The job for me is to get out of your way so that you can talk to Edmund. Now, Edmund, we're going to follow a kind of a format here. I think the audience would like to know a little bit about you personally, or maybe a lot about you personally. I've enjoyed our conversations. And then we'll just sort of step through, if we could, kind of what's top of your in tray. What sort of things, particularly in this rapidly changing world, do you find surprising, funny, and then maybe some of the social, technical, economic, political themes that you're tumbling across in what is truly a unique position. So would you mind by just opening just maybe a little bit about yourself? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Michael, very much. And I'm honoured and delighted to be able to take part in this CommunityZ Chest online event, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I won't label my CV because I think that's people have seen that, but the point is that my background, as you say, is in external relations, a number of posts around the world, but a career that was mainly focused on the Middle East, and I'm what the Foreign Office calls an Arabist, part of that fairly well-known group within the Foreign Office, and my experience was, I guess, the key themes running through that experience has been international security and international relations. And now my present job, after I left, stopped working for HMG, I joined the UN as coordinator of sanctions on Al-Qaida and the Taliban, and also as the chief assessor of the threat posed by these groups. I'm effectively, you could say I'm the UN counterpart of the head of the UK's JTAC, the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre. And this all builds on my previous experience of debriefing on terrorist issues and of diplomatic negotiation on cooperating to manage those issues. And indeed, of course, of communicating them to a wider audience, explaining why we do what we do. There's a lot more I could say here about the totality of the UN response to terrorism, and how that is structured. But really, the time is limited. I don't want to sort of get bogged down in that, but I'll happily answer any questions on it. I usually speak to official audiences on specific counter-terrorism topics, and I was really intrigued when I saw the format that you have, the people who've used for these meetings, and I wanted to adhere to it, and found that as I was sort of working my remarks through it, that it was really challenging and interesting, and I hope it's come out that way, because it's nice to speak in a less in a less sort of formulaic way than I'm used to. The top of the in-tray point, I think I have to say on that, inevitably, it's keeping abreast of the threat, always, understanding its evolution, how it's likely to impact on us all. And so under this heading, I think this would be the moment for me to just give a quick skip through the team's perspective on the global threat currently posed by ISIL and Al-Qaida, and including in that the impact of COVID-19 on all of it. Just to rehash some key developments of the past 18 months, we remember the fall of the so-called caliphate in early 2019, the killing of Baghdadi later in the year, the appointment of Amr al-Mawla as his successor. Everyone will recall the horrific attacks in Sri Lanka in the spring last year. That was sort of an inspired, ISIL-inspired attack with strategic impact, but it was also in contrast with a trend of reduced international attacks associated with ISIL from a high watermark in 2015, 2016, and then really dramatically reduced in the years since then. This year began with a continuation of many of the trends from last year. Attempts by ISIL to consolidate as a covert network in Iraq and Syria, and to increase the tempo of local attacks in the core region. The international community was continuing efforts to address the legacy of displaced persons. Sorry. Apologies, that was a phone.
That was a displaced person, I think.
That was a displaced person, yes. Displaced persons, detainees, and dependents in northeastern Syria. And we were working on mitigating both the security risk that those people represent, but also the humanitarian issues around that. Unfortunately, the political, legal, and practical difficulties of this issue are now complicated by COVID-19, of course. The monitoring team has been assessing other impacts of the pandemic on terrorists and the threat that they pose. ISIL's own response has been broadly in three areas. First of all, let's attack our enemies while they're distracted. Secondly, let's celebrate this divine punishment of them. And then thirdly, let's not catch the virus. And so there's restrictions on travel, gatherings, and things of that sort. And then there are a few other things that are worth considering, in terms of, what does terrorism and counterterrorism look like in the pandemic era? Could there be a bottling up and release effect? There continue to be few attacks in non-conflict zones. ISIL has not restored its own capacity to direct attacks internationally. And of course, inspired attacks at the moment don't work very well. It's a time when public targets are scarce. And terrorist travel has been disrupted. And indeed, we've seen one or two cases of terrorists trying to travel during the pandemic and actually getting arrested. But this may have added urgency to their own planning. They've always been planning to revive the external operations capability, and it may well be that this has given them the sort of both the incentive and perhaps the sort of breathing space in which to do some of this. Their propaganda and online activity have had a captive audience to work on. And of course, there's another point of motivation. They've been marginalized from the news by COVID-19. There hasn't been much talk of terrorism over the last 5 months or so. Also, their new leader, Al-Mawla, has been very hesitant to communicate. And this may provide an imperative to act to retain relevance. So I think we should just be alert to the possibility that there might be attacks as COVID-19 restrictions are eased. The pandemic has further accentuated the difference between the threat trajectory in non-conflict zones where it has reduced and conflict zones where it's increased and is likely to increase further. In conflict zones, it's very difficult to impose meaningful travel restrictions, of course, and border controls may be non-existent in some regions. And of course, then there's this issue of economic distress, the sense of political marginalization as well. These may be exacerbated by the pandemic's impact on people's welfare and on the functioning of states. Observers often talk about the risk of ISIL or Al-Qaeda using some kind of bioweapon. And we mustn't dismiss this as a threat. We know they're aware of the option of using COVID-19 to infect enemies, but there isn't any evidence that they have developed practical plans of this kind, whereas there are other strains of terrorists who've taken it a little bit further. Member states of the United Nations continue to believe that ISIL will broadly hold its previous course under the new leader. But of course, he'll have to adapt to evolving challenges, including the pandemic. Delegation of authority from the core leadership to the remote provinces was already underway, and that was following a long-established trend that existed in Al-Qaida, and is likely to continue, I think, in both terrorist groups, with regional affiliates increasingly setting their own objectives and taking on local characteristics and embedding themselves in local conflicts. ISIL and Al-Qaida are active in too many locations around the world for me to mention in this brief presentation, but I'll just highlight Afghanistan as another key conflict zone for both groups. The dynamics of the ongoing peace process will impact unpredictably on both of them. ISIL Khorasan has suffered severe setbacks over the past 8 months in its former strongholds in the eastern part of the country, but it remains a threat. It hopes to regroup and consolidate and rally to its flag all elements in Afghanistan that are opposed to the peace process. Sunday's attack on Jalalabad prison and the release of inmates was a stark reminder of the continuing relevance of the group. The US-Taliban agreement envisages the Taliban continuing to fight ISIL-K and also increasingly acting to suppress Al-Qaida and the large numbers of foreign terrorist fighters present in Afghanistan. And of course, should the Al-Qaida leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is believed to be in Afghanistan, should he succumb to age and poor health, a leadership succession would be very challenging for Al-Qaida in the context of an Afghan peace process. The other region I'll just briefly touch on is West Africa and the Sahel area, where local affiliates of both ISIL and Al-Qaida continue to enjoy operational successes. They both seem to be mounting deliberate challenges to stability in the local jurisdictions and undermining state authority. They exploit local issues, and they even had a period of local ISIL-Al-Qaida deconfliction, which was very interesting because it was so much at odds with the poor relations that exist between the two groups at the leadership level and in many regions. That understanding broke down in West Africa this year, and their affiliates in the Sahel are now fighting each other. Not clear how that will impact on the threat. So that's the top of my intro, the threat. We have to keep this constantly updated, looking at what's happening and listening to what our member state interlocutors are telling us.
Your intro is actually very transparent. You kindly, folks, Edmund has shared one of their latest reports with you on the website and also in the resource area. And it does make a fascinating read, because I think what's interesting, Edmund, is people are always curious, what does somebody like you do? And you lay it out really quite transparently. So thank you.
Well, I think part of what we do is that we are in receipt of privileged information from member states, but they know that we will use our expertise to declassify it, to sanitize it, and to use it. And sometimes they'll tell us things and say you mustn't use this in any form, but often they're telling us things which they wouldn't themselves be willing to say publicly, but which we're able then to put into reframe into our reports. And in a way, it's a way that member states, I suppose, are moving the terms of the debate on counterterrorism, partly through our through our agency.
Just a quick question on your map here. Somebody's asking, we've got some questions actually about North Korea coming up in a minute. But I noticed North Korea isn't on here. Is that because it's not in your remit, or is that just not in our remit? I mean, no ISIL or Al-Qaida connection there. Of course, I have good friends and colleagues who are working on the North Korea issue. That's just internal UN colleague business. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you.
So most surprising or thought-provoking? Yeah, I think the most provocative thing I want to say is that I'm not a propagandist for the counter-terrorist industry. I believe in a sort of ruthless objectivity and keeping a sense of proportion on these issues. Terrorism is a serious matter. Yes, it requires our attention and serious countermeasures, but it's nowhere near the biggest threat that we face. Consider the cost of COVID-19, for example, in lives, economic damage, disruption to our way of life, our peace of mind, our future. Consider environmental issues, plastic waste, climate change, elimination of endangered species, destruction of forests. Consider the cost of warfare, crime, the strategic threat posed by aggressive state actors with cyber capabilities, or CBRN capabilities, or even just conventional military capabilities. There was a period after 9/11 when counterterrorism was over-resourced beyond any realistic relative assessment of other threats. Something about terrorism grabs attention and it attracts resource. We mustn't allow that to get out of proportion. On the other hand, my more doom-laden rider to all of this is that the underlying issues which gave rise to Al-Qaida and ISIL have not been solved, and they are getting worse in general. Conflict, ungoverned space, the clash of civilizations rhetoric that's now occurring between takfiris and white supremacists, marginalization of youth. And these are strategic challenges which, if they're left to fester, will mean that terrorism will probably come back worse at some point in the future. Moving to funniest, which was the next slide. There are, funnily enough, there are times when terrorists are funny, I think. Their qualms about catching COVID-19 certainly amused me. Many in the international community were talking up the bio threat that infected extremists might run amok, infecting us all. And, you know, as I say, they have had thoughts about this, but they've also said, let's not travel to Europe because that sounds awfully risky. And you know, for a group which has an affiliate, the IS Central African Province, co-located with an Ebola outbreak near to the Ugandan border in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and failed to draw the obvious conclusions about what that offered in terms of a human-born bio-suicide weapon, it seems unlikely that they will do much with the much less weaponizable COVID-19. And it's really white supremacists who look far more likely, I've already, in fact, have taken some action of that kind and are likely probably to do so again. There's also a certain comedy value in some of the Al-Qaeda and ISIL propaganda. The ISIL fanboy posts are especially silly, presumably cooked up in many cases in their bedrooms in their parents' house. You know, they celebrate hurricanes as soldiers of Allah, COVID-19 as well. These are taunts, really, on the level of a football hooligan celebrating an opposition player's extramarital affair or a manager's heart attack. And with true adolescent photoshopping skills, they had us worried about Leo Messi being decapitated in a jumpsuit in a Russian soccer stadium during the 2018 World Cup. And of course, nothing happened. ISIL themselves were conscious of this as a failure, which risked undermining the overall credibility of the group and its propaganda. So there's a sort of brief humorous interlude, and then we move on to the themes in this interesting step format: social, technical, economic, and political. And I've done this very, very briefly, just bullets of thoughts. On the social side, we do need to address the xenophobia that's been a growing feature in the West. I'm not a bleeding heart liberal, and I recognize the legitimacy of concerns on issues like immigration. But fear of the other is not a policy, and it's self-defeating. Exclusion, except in the narrowest sense, when it's possible to keep an identified threat outside our borders, will usually only breed alienation and radicalization. Moving to technical, in a CT context, that will often refer to cyber concerns about threats where the internet is a key factor, online propaganda, recruitment, instruction, organization, fundraising, or even the medium in which an attack is carried out, so hacking or targeting of infrastructure via computer access. On the latter front, ISIL and Al-Qaeda have once again shown little ambition or capability so far. State actors and non-state actors, but also non-terrorist actors, non-state non-terrorist actors have been in the vanguard, but the threat requires monitoring. The exploitation of the internet by ISIL and Al-Qaeda is more in the abuse of online platforms and encryption for propaganda and communications. And this is the subject of much international action, with the UN a key player in convening fora for member states and tech companies. Progress has been made, for example, in the lead time to take down extremist content. And Europol had a notable success in cleansing the Telegram platform in late 2019. But this is, I think, probably a permanent self-refreshing task, and much still to be done on it. Next to my mind is the really big COVID-19 related CT risk, and that is that the economic damage of the pandemic will plunge many people into acute poverty, add to grievances and feelings of marginalization, and derail government efforts to provide welfare as well as security. The political point is about international unity. There's a high degree of agreement on counterterrorism, and even more so on ISIL and Al-Qaida. Their tactics and ideology are so repulsive that the international adversaries can usually agree, at least in theory, to work against them. The Security Council can all get together on this point, creating good personal relationships, a habit of cooperation, which can then become valuable in facilitating engagement on more contentious issues. In other words, it's worth emphasizing counterterrorism work, not just for its inherent value, but also because it's a center of excellence in UN functioning and in wider international understanding. My biggest ask, the next slide. So this would be really on behalf of colleagues, my colleagues in member states who are responsible for tackling terrorism head on a day-to-day basis. Give them a break. They're the goalkeepers. Sorry, I keep coming back to soccer analogies. This is one of my own obsessions, as you can probably tell. You know, a Leicester City fan as well. So yeah, they are the counterterrorism professionals are the goalkeepers, and they're only ever remembered for the ones they let in. They may stop 95 or 99% of plots, but for good security reasons, most of us will never even hear of these, while some public commentators will want us to forget the successes and the reality of the legal and resource constraints under which they operate, and crucify them for anything that does go wrong. I've often said that if terrorists were smarter than they are, if they understood the disruption caused by certain types of incident, they could tailor their UK strategy at least to keeping the security services permanently tied up with COBRA meetings and inquiries. If you used more known terrorists for low-tech, unpreventable attacks like the Lee Rigby killing, and if you do more kidnaps, and these are things which just turn the government inside out into a sort of frenzy of introspection and crisis management. So in both cases, the impact on CT resources can be huge and do more damage to the public interest than the attacks themselves. This present period of low threat in non-conflict zones is actually what CT success looks like. We mustn't assume that it will be sustained. We must develop stronger stomachs for living with an ambient threat, an ambient level of threat and violence. People speak absurdly of ending terrorism, but that is no more realistic than ending crime or ending pollution. We need to get back to the resilience we had to show when the IRA was mounting attacks in the mainland. The US needs to look at the number of lives lost to attack theory terrorism and put that in the context of the number of lives lost, for example, in wider extremist violence and firearms incidents overall. Post 9/11, it's a tiny proportion, and its significance in policy formation should be given the appropriate weighting. I suppose what I'm saying is keep things in proportion and be suspicious of media or political voices that urge you not to do so. And that's the end of my prepared presentation.
Well, that is absolutely wonderful and perfectly to time, with lots of time for questions and a lot of questions on the board. Just to get things going, there's an interesting question here from Martin White, and he's basically wondering, do you feel that your role makes you a terrorist target out of proportion to a normal individual? Is there that type of personal targeting?
There is an element of that, yeah. I mean, the UN treats me as one of the people that they're concerned about my personal safety. And that's partly because of the role that I'm performing for the UN, but it is also partly a legacy from my profile with the British government before I joined the UN, and the UN security people factor that in as well. It means, for example, that when I make trips to Afghanistan, my colleagues will go to some of the provinces of Afghanistan, but I'm only allowed to make short, brief visits to Kabul with close protection and then leave again.
Bob McDowell has a question, I think, related to the bit about Lionel Messi in Instagram. What counter propaganda is deployed against terrorists? You know, for example, do you put out, not you personally, but does the team in any way look at putting out ridiculous messages about terrorism of a sort of humorous nature?
I suppose I do a very, very marginal contribution on that through my own social. But I'm only communicating to a few thousand people, so I wouldn't make a big deal of that. And the team is really more focused on the threat side. The whole sort of issue of countering and preventing violent extremism is something that the wider UN CT effort takes very seriously. I'm not sure how well they do it, and I'm not sure how well member states in general do it. I think counter-narrative is much more difficult than narrative, and I think that there's a whole science around this, and I'm really an amateur in this area. But I think the one thing I would say from my own personal experience is that people don't like to feel that they're being targeted by official messaging. It's very rare that official messaging will have the same resonance as private and subversive messaging that we're trying to counteract. And therefore, I think by far the most effective counter propaganda is almost of a different sort. And again, it brings us back to soccer. That World Cup was probably a really effective piece of counter propaganda messaging for two reasons. One is that there was this sort of manifest failure of ISIL to do anything about the World Cup, and they themselves afterwards said, we really looked stupid there. We promised the world and we delivered absolutely nothing. So that in itself was good propaganda, just successful counter-terrorism, I suppose, in a way, or prevention. But the other side of it, of course, is the joy of football and the community side of it and what that does in terms of messaging. And of course, many people will remember the case of that little boy who wore a plastic shopping bag with pale blue and white stripes and wanted to think he was an Afghan kid who wanted to sort of worship Lionel Messi, and then Lionel Messi sent him a replica shirt with his name on, and that sort of thing. I think I think governments sort of enabling and encouraging that sort of thing, but not branding it as government, because as soon as you do that, you're lost.
In an age of dis, and fake information, there are some interesting bits. Peter Lanshoff, just following that theme a little bit, asked a few years ago, a Royal Society report claimed that few terrorists were that clever. Is that really the case?
As in clever enough to do what? Sorry.
Just clever in general.
I see. Yes.
Not smart.
I think you're right. I mean, and I guess that was implicit in what I was saying about some of the propaganda really being just sort of excitable teenagers, and also the sort of the lack of reflection apparently on what works. Not realizing that something like the Lee Rigby killing was a really good example of something that sent the British government into convulsions, but nobody seems to ever to study this on the terrorist side, learn the lessons of it, and then sort of strategically direct things in that way. And I'm always struck by this with terrorist methodology. They obsess over things like ricin is one of the things that they've sort of dabbled at inconclusively up to now. You'll see lots and lots of injunctions to do things, and some of those things look like they might be very effective. And one of the things, I suppose, where they have been successful is, in sort of recognizing the impact of things like vehicle attacks on crowds. That does have a very high disruptive capability. It's also very cheap. It's also almost unpreventable. And that is a case perhaps where they were smart enough to understand that they'd stumble on something very effective. But interestingly, after that dreadful high-rise fire in West London a few years ago, ISIL started talking in their propaganda about the need to do more arson attacks. And I was worried at that time, because arson is exactly that. It's impossible to detect. It's mass casualty. It's terrifying, and particularly in certain environments, it could be phenomenally destructive. But they've never picked it up. They've never actually said, yeah, that was a good idea. We haven't done it yet, but let's do it now. They seem to forget about things and then get distracted by the next shiny object.
For understandable reasons, given yesterday's tragic incident in Beirut, there are a number of comments about Lebanon, but without asking you to comment on what is clearly a breaking news situation, there's a deeper question from Bob McDowell. How important is the possible economic and financial collapse of the Lebanon and the consequent creation of a failed state on Middle East-based terrorism. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's very, very troubling indeed. And yeah, I won't say anything about the incident because, of course, we don't know the nature of it. No particular reason yet to think that it was anything other than a disastrous accident or something of the kind. But yeah, the wider point about Lebanon is important. Of course, Lebanon is umbilically linked to Syria. One of the points that I perhaps didn't make as clearly as I might have done in the presentation is I still see the main ISIL threat as being concentrated in that core region. I think the problems in Syria and Iraq are very far from being solved, and I think we will see the core of ISIL, continue to survive and potentially resurge depending upon other events. Now, to have Lebanon in free fall is obviously extremely unhelpful for that very same reason. You've got all sorts of extremist actors in Lebanon. Generally speaking, the idea of enforcement by one set of extremists against another is not a good one. We all know the origins of ISIL were partly in the sort of takeover of sort of Shia chauvinism immediately after 2003, and so the idea of a sort of Lebanon becoming part of that sort of Syria, Iraq wider area is not a happy one. That said, a lot of good stuff is happening in Lebanon as well, and certainly the UK has always sent very capable people to Lebanon, and a lot of work has been done on strengthening those parts of the Lebanese infrastructure that do or can work. So I haven't given up on it, but it is worrying.
Phil Williams has made a number of comments, but I think I can string them together into one slightly long question, but might be a short answer. He points out that Obama said the American people seemed happy to spend billions on counterterrorism to save a few lives, yet did not want him to spend a penny on gun control. So he kind of wonders about our sanity. He also wonders, in your opinion, should the West scale back the sale of arms to some of these identified hotspots? Is that itself a partial source of the problem? And very finally, with China moving up in the world and also being an arms exporter, do you see an increase in China's involvement in troubled spots?
Yeah. So first point, all I can say is I completely agree. I think Obama's manifestly right, and as he so often is. On the second point, the impact of gun sales. Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one. We look at this. The arms embargo is part of our. It's one of the sanctions measures that we're responsible for, and we get a lot of angst from member states. Interestingly enough, some influential states who say that they worry about the availability of arms to terrorists. The situation is very varied around the world. And yeah, a lot depends on the sort of the environment that's been created in a certain place. So you've got utter mayhem in Libya and around Libya, with sort of massive arms, no control. Yemen, I used to deal with, of course, very closely, and they say there are more Kalashnikovs than people in Yemen. I don't know if it's true, but it's pretty alarming availability of weapons. Now, with some of these, you can't help feeling that the stable door, it cannot now be usefully shut because the horse has bolted. But that said, there are many jurisdictions in which availability of weapons to terrorists is still an issue for the terrorists. The supply chain is an issue, and there's places like that where the arms embargo is most important. And yes, arms sales, it's a problem, definitely if you don't have confidence in who you're supplying to, definitely if you're supplying to people who may sell on. And there is a certain amount of that going on in a number of conflict zones around the world. So I think it's something that needs to be looked at as a policy issue. But whether that is a strong enough reason to scale back in some strategic areas, I can't say. It's really way above my pay grade.
Yeah, well, Mark Duff points out there are 3 firearms for every U.S. citizen. So yeah, that horse is truly bolted. Yes.
Yes, and the point about China, sorry, yeah, China is becoming a very big player, of course. I think the interesting thing about that is that China has a stronger and stronger interest in stability and security in a wider range of countries. And so one of the reasons for optimism in the Afghan peace process is that there is an increasingly significant Chinese national interest in that whole Belt and Road, and of course, you know, if you have the Security Council operating more and more in concert on something like that, you have a better chance of success. So I think if anything, it's a cause for mild optimism.
Edwina Morton, who has a long history of covering these things for The Economist, geopolitics, says that keeping things in proportion was a message of some criticism around the time of the 9/11 attacks. She heard serious people complaining about folk crying wolf. So surely if you give these folks space, they will use it, and their imaginations are limitless. You know, is that, you know, message of not tolerance, which is a different thing, but that message of keeping things in proportion really the right thing to say?
Well, I think it is. I think it always has to be, because in the end, resources are finite, and resources have to be allocated, and that includes state resources and government bandwidth. So if we heavily resource something that only produces a very small proportion of the threat, by definition, we're under-resourcing things which produce a higher proportion of the threat. So I think that's the point. I mean, I do take the point, and you know, goodness knows I am a CT professional. It's hardly in my interest to say that we should wrap up the CT industry. That would be absurd. As I said, you know, the CT industry is important. It needs to function. It needs to function smartly. It needs to use its resource well, and we need to avoid, you know, things like siloing, which occur in some cases where you have inefficiency in sharing of information and things like that. You get that sort of thing right, you may actually achieve more than you do by just throwing endless resource without thinking about it. One of the things the UN, I think, is quite good at, and it's worth just bearing this in mind, is the UN does a lot of capacity building. If that capacity building is well directed, and if it is producing, you know, significant new capabilities, whether it's forensic capabilities for a police force or whether it's improved border security, and if all of it is linked with the necessary enablers of international cooperation, so not just the encouragement of information sharing, but also enabling information sharing by ensuring that there are certain standards of compliance which enable partners to work with each other rather than being afraid of you know, sort of potential compliance issues of sharing information. The UN can actually do a lot of good with relatively limited resource, and so yes, important, but don't overdo it.
I've got about 8 comments from David Massell, many of them interesting. He points out that Ricin was deployed in the Twin Towers, but the air conditioning filters stopped it. He's also got a number of really cool observations about North Korea. I didn't realize, obviously there's the coal transfers at sea, but apparently they export as well animation, and that's a big business for them, exporting that to Korea and Japan to make money. So lots of interesting stuff here. But he asked a question I expected an audience of ours to ask, which is really the role of cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. And, you know, how do you feel about cryptocurrencies versus traditional currencies in your space?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question, and it's something that we look at. And again, a little bit like other technologies, whether we're talking about, you know, financial technologies or others, ISIL and Al-Qaida are not necessarily hugely advanced, at least in the practical use that they've made of it. They're certainly aware of it, very aware of it. There are quite a few recorded cases already of cryptocurrency being an element in terror finance. In actual cases, there have been 1 or 2 arrests. So it's not something I dismiss for a minute. We tend to see it as an emerging challenge, an emerging threat. And once again, and this connects a little bit to the previous question, that question of resourcing. Cryptocurrency is obviously part of a wider concern about financial, you know, financial controls and financial technologies, and so you get to money laundering, and you get to organized crime, and all of those other things which are relevant in these connections. And the UN, in fact, has just just has recently passed a resolution on links between organized crime and terrorism. I guess the point I'm making is, let's look at cryptocurrency on its very specifically on the regulatory challenge that it poses, and then consider the CT dimension of that in context. So that's what we try to do. We're overwhelmed with information about it. We talk to all of the FIUs around the world. We also have an observer role with FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. So it's something that we do, and you'll see in our reports that there's usually a paragraph on it where what we end up saying usually is, yes, these groups are interested in this, and yes, we need to continue to monitor it. Yes, member states are still concerned about it, but as yet, it's not a significant component of terror finance.
A lot of people, with the sum, I think the assets under control of ISIL are sort of believed to be around 100 million, which in financial services terms is one family's wealth. There would be a lot of people in financial services who would say that the objective of anti-money laundering is to reduce tax evasion, which is a different discussion, but to wrap it up as being at all effective against counterterrorism or for counterterrorism. Is really just addressing the government's put on it. How helpful is the work that a lot of us do in anti-money laundering to you?
I think it's helpful in the sense that we're rolling a big stone up a hill, and we're only a very, very small proportion of the way up the hill. I think, this is not something, again, coming back to what was being said earlier about, well, if you stop doing this, what happens? These things, this is very necessary. The whole question of the sort of connection between terror finance, money laundering, terror finance, counterterrorism in general, it's an interesting nexus. I don't think that the international community has any high level of agreement on this. I think the level of intelligence coverage of terror finance is surprisingly poor globally. I think there are a number of reasons for that, but probably not time to go into them. But when you think about the kind of lack of precision that exists in estimates of the assets of these various groups, you can tell that there's a problem here in terms of what's really known even in intelligence circles about this question, and why it hasn't been perhaps a higher priority. One of the things that's worth at least considering in this connection is, what is the objective? Is the objective to stop these groups from getting money that they can use to carry out terrorist attacks? Well, that's obviously one objective. But if somebody's going to hire a car and drive it into a crowd, or buy a knife and stab somebody, that's not going to be relevant. Or is the objective as a tool of counterterrorism investigations, and you end up investigating and ultimately disrupting networks because of being able to follow financial tracking. So I think these are, I can't really give you an answer on this, but the fact is there's a hell of a lot more work to be done on it.
We're running out of time, but I'm going to try if we can squeeze some in here. An interesting bit, it's really just about your cyber under your technical. We've got, for example, Mark Duff pointing out with the requirement to work from home and the uptake on buying online, et cetera. What's the threat to internet access? Dave, who spoke earlier, is wondering, should strong cryptography be classified as arms, et cetera. But Hugh Perch has got, I think, a really subtle point here. Of great power. If major state players see better returns in cyber terrorism and interference, which appears to be what we're being told by the authorities about the origins of much of the online interference, might they move away from supporting traditional terror groups? Or my supplement to that is, or might they be more acquiescent in allowing cyber terrorism by truly rogue groups, because that means that there's somebody worse than they are?
Yeah, it's a pretty deep question. I mean, I suppose the fundamental point which I made in the presentation is that the groups that I cover have not yet shown a lot of ambition in this area, although ISIL had a very high cyber capability for defensive purposes. They had very, very developed IT skills and very, very designer encryption and things like that. So they're not fools by any means. the reality of computer-borne threat, to member states, to critical national infrastructures and things of that kind. I think that the reality is that just is overwhelmingly represented by member states themselves. In other words, member state cyber capability outstrips the ISIL or Al-Qaida, by 100 or 1,000 to 1. I don't know. It's not comparable. Now, as soon as you get into the question of what kind of mischief is in the interests of member states, then you're outside my remit, because we can only function on the basis that we are working with member states to deal with these two organizations that pose a threat to all member states.
There are loads more questions, and I wish we had more time, and I'm trying to pick, sadly, one. But I'll just note, Ian Smales would wish we had more time to talk about the annexation of the West Bank and what this might do as a spur to ISIL or Al-Qaeda attacks. This question, is there a list of the soft touches who do not realize that they're helping to put out subversion? And there's an very interesting point here about inclusion and diversity agenda. Might it actually hamper some of the practical measures, the political appetite to tackle some of this? So lots of good stuff out there if we have more time. But I'm gonna pick on a question Donald McRae has, and probably turn it into the conversation after our second port at dinner. What is the fundamental cause of terrorism, and can we influence it?
Yeah, it's a good question, that fundamental cause of terrorism, and can we influence it? I mean, I think, terrorism is tricky because of the definitional issue. As you know, the United Nations doesn't even have a definition of terrorism, and yet it has a whole counter-terrorist industry, and it manages that ambiguity reasonably effectively, because in the end there's an element with terrorism that you kind of know it when you see it, and therefore maybe you don't have to have an absolutely watertight definition, although there are some member states who would disagree with that. I think we have, on the one hand, state-sponsored terrorism, states using terrorist tactics against one another, and that is obviously linked to conflict. And so I think that is something where it's a question of making sure that the disincentives are strong enough to prevent people from thinking that's a tool of war of which the cost is acceptably low. The cost needs to be driven up. And that, I think, is that's one dynamic that's really very hard to deal with, other than by driving up the cost of international misconduct. When you're talking about groups like ISIL and Al-Qaeda, not state-sponsored groups, but an ideology, a sort of nihilistic ideology in many ways, certainly in the case of ISIL, really sometimes something that feels almost like a death cult in many ways. It's a little easier, because really you're looking at just hard counterterrorism is the main point. You're trying to stop these people. You're trying to disrupt them. You're trying to arrest them. If you can get people to turn and actually sort of decide that it was a bad idea all along, and then sort of either become people who help you in one way or another, or sort of actually sort of feed back a more helpful message into their groups, then that's what you're looking at. But in terms of stopping the direction of terrorism, so as I said earlier, I think that the key damage that COVID-19 will do in the terrorism area is that it is just going to make us all poorer and unhappier for a while. And I think that is going to have a disproportionate impact in some places and on some communities. And I think it probably means that we will see an increase in this sort of, nihilistic or rejectionist type terrorism, and obviously the best way to stop that is to improved prosperity, reduced conflict, improved communication, reduced marginalization. There are all sorts of things, all of the whole gamut of PVE and CVE. It's all relevant in this connection, but it's going to be very, very hard to make progress on it in present circumstances.
Edmund, that's great. Sadly, I'm going to have to kind of draw a line under this conversation due to time. I've got loads of people coming in thanking you, which is always rewarding to me that I've exceeded time. Uh, you brought some really good messages forward on the social bit about resisting xenophobia. The interesting bit for me that cyber is very much a part of your world, a warning to us about the economics of COVID and what that might do to prosperity and making more of these young youths disaffected. And I thought as well the political point there, the counterterrorism is sort of weirdly positive. It's one area that the member states can work together and achieve things in reasonable order. So that a precursor to many other things under the Sustainable Development Goals that need to be tackled. So I thought that's quite a nice positive note. It's rare that we get somebody from your world meeting our world. It's sort of like you're having a dinner party and then somebody has a nasty accident and the ambulance arrives and the lights are flashing. And you knew it was all there, but you didn't want to see it. And I thank you for sharing some of that with us today. I've really got 3 rounds of thanks to give quickly, and one is clearly to our sponsors. The fact that you let us explore these things in this community is fantastic, so thank you all. We have a whole bunch of theological bargains on the Long Finance and ZN websites, ideas to deal with everything, but I must say, very few to do with handling terrorism. So thoughts there on what we could do, folks, from all of you. I would like to thank the audience, particularly vibrant today. Really good stuff. Thanks for getting the comments in. And I'm sorry I couldn't feed them all in the time available. But what I think is kind of neat is we're going to have a slightly different session as well tomorrow, which I would encourage you all to come. It's going to feature the quite world famous photographer Mark Schlossman. And he's going to be, it's called Going, Going, Gone. And he's talking about a project he's been working on for nearly 2 decades on extinction, actually going out and photographing the extinct species that sit in many of our museums. We'll be talking about the scale of that devastation. And again, audience, we're thinking caps on as we try and figure out how we might help him. But Edmund, you're here today, and we've enjoyed it very, very much. And you've taken a lot of time to come at us from Austin, Texas, which I thought was an interesting place for you to be located during a cut time of COVID-19. And I'm afraid I can't technically open up things and have the audience applaud. So I have my little Buddhist from Korea, no less, not North Korea, folks, South Korea, my little Buddhist knocker here, my karmic clapper, if you will, and I'll applaud on behalf of the audience. But thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts. We really appreciated it.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you. So goodbye, Edmund. Goodbye, one and all, and we'll see you all again soon.